Welcome once again to the National Newspaper Publishers Association. We're grateful to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for providing the resources for the NNPA to have a national education public awareness program. Our focus is on how to close the education gap that exists between African American and other people of color students across the United States in the public school systems, but also in higher education. But right now we want to focus on the public school systems. We're pleased to be joined today by Dr. Patricia A. Edwards, distinguished professor at Michigan State University. And Dr. Edwards, you have a long career in education matters. Uh, Give us your first overview of how you see the situation. Because of the coronavirus, is the education gap widening or is it narrowing? What's your sense?
I think the education gap is definitely widening. And I do think in a lot of schools, especially here in Michigan, they did not have good connections with families before COVID-19. And of course, they know that schools cannot and would not exist without parents, and you don't choose the parents that you work with. And I think now more than ever, they are realizing the importance of family engagement, that every student in a class represents a family, and they need to make those connections. I know some years ago when I first came to Michigan, I worked with a school and I said, you need to do a demographic profile because this school was built in 1952. In 1952, it was an all-white community. In 1990, when I went there to that school, they did not have the same demographics. And I do think people need to realize that not all parents are the same. Not all parents
Yes.
are the same, and we don't have the picket fence and 2 children, a dog and a cat, and the stay-home mom. And I think some schools think of families that way.
Exactly. How do you see, I know a lot of school systems, because of the virus, are engaging in distance education.
Hmm.
How is it in Michigan, and what is your view across the country about distance education with African American students and parents? Because of course, distance education means that the parents got to be more involved because they're at home with the student.
Well, that's true, but in a lot of communities, it's not the parent there, it's another caregiver. And I think COVID came up on school districts so quickly. And I
Yes.
think it has a lot to do with what zip code you live in. And so if you're in a zip code where all the parents have to work in order to make a living, it might not be clear what is happening with the children during COVID. I mean, this semester I'm teaching interns, and so our students here at Michigan State do a 5th year, and they're in 5 different school districts, and they all tell me different kinds of things. And so some of the children don't sign on when they're supposed to, or sometimes there are glitches with the online ways of doing things. I think teachers have had to reformat and think about other innovative, creative ways to teach online versus teaching face to face. So I think some of those, the kind of grouping that teachers would normally do, the kind of one-on-one instruction, I think that's complicated by COVID, and it really becomes a problem when there's not an adult there to really guide the child.
Can you talk about, I know one of your specialties is reading. Can
Yes.
you talk about the importance of the 3rd grade reading test across the country and our performance of African American students being able to pass this test?
Well, I have been, I challenged some of the legislators here in the state of Michigan about the 3rd grade reading law. It's another way to really put children of color, another thing you put on their head about the 3rd grade reading law. And to be honest with you, I have said that they shouldn't even give the test this year because, people always talking about the summer reading slump.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
now we're going to have a baby slump because these kids have been out of school since March, and we have no clear idea as to when they're going to be going back. And so I think sometimes people give tests to say that they are leveling the playing field, but what they're actually doing is creating a gulf and creating more of a divide when they give these tests. And of course, we tend to know who is not doing well. And I think when it comes to reading, we've had so many different ways in which we've taught children of color, and there's been so many mixed messages of how to make those connections. And
Yeah.
so I think when it comes to that third grade reading law, it might sound good and equitable and fair, but I do think it's very divisive. And I've talked to the state superintendent about that too.
Good. Well, speaking of demographic changes, Michigan is one of those states that is still undergoing demographic changes. I know, particularly in the city of Detroit.
Yes,
but,
it
but
is.
but the thing is, given the demographic changes and given the prevalence of people of color students all across the country now in public school systems, do you see any of the systemic changes that kind of make adjustment for the demographic changes? In other words, are school systems culturally sensitive as they should be?
Mhm. Well, let me say this. I know we're not specifically talking about teachers, but I know for the last 25, 26 years, Michigan State's program has been ranked #1 in the nation. And when I first came here, Judith Lanier was my dean, and she
Yes.
was talking about teaching for conceptual understanding. And I said, Dr. Lanier, we cannot teach for conceptual understanding unless we conceptually understand something about the people that we're teaching. For the last 30 years that I've been here at Michigan State, most of my students are young white students. Like even this semester, I have 17 young white females, one African American female, one Asian female, and one Asian male. That is the teaching profession. And so I put forth the argument that can you imagine finishing medical school and you've never learned how to deal with a patient? Well, if teaching is a profession, we need to collect data because we're in a data-driven society. So some years ago, I wrote a book entitled A Path to Follow, Learning to Listen to Parents, where I have parents talk about their literacy histories because teaching is connecting. So you can't just walk in a classroom and start teaching. And so that has worked really well to show teachers how they can understand the literacy histories of the students that they're teaching. And let's say, for example, you go to the hospital, you might have two senior doctors in the room with 4 residents. Well, I argue that in a school, you have teachers who've been teaching for 30 years and teachers who've been teaching less than a year. So why can't we have these co-generative conversations? So, because sometimes people tend to put children of color in beginning teachers' classrooms. And I personally think it takes 3 to 5 years to figure out how to teach. And so to me, I have been pushing that agenda is that we need to collect data about the students that we are working with. It's not the tourist curriculum where we look at how they dress, what they eat. We have to understand their literacy histories and figure out how we can make those connections. Just as doctors collect family histories, lawyers collect depositions, architects collect a lot of information about our lifestyles, we need to connect that information, and it needs to be done on a year-to-year basis because children's lives change.
Yes. In another taping, we have the decline in black male teachers,
Yeah.
or black female teachers too in some places.
Hmm.
How can we recruit more African Americans into the teaching profession?
Well, that is really an interesting issue because a lot of people that are teachers have not encouraged their children to go into teaching. And I know it's not that we are liking students of color in this state, but going into teaching, I mean, in fact, some years ago, we even had a grant where we were targeting students. We say, grow your own. And still students can come and be in the program and decide that they don't really want to teach, or they don't want to teach in the communities in which they left, which can also be an issue. So I do think we need to do teacher recruitment. I think our best bet is to have someone who has been in another profession. Like one of my former graduate students worked on Wall Street and she majored in economics down at the University of Michigan. She's a person of color. And she decided that she would come back and go into teaching that way. But that is an issue, is how do we get more teachers of color? Of course, let me say this to you, some of my colleagues that are not people of color will argue with you that the teacher doesn't make a difference. I've been involved in some really combative arguments
Yes.
about that, because they'll say you don't have to be of the color of the student in order to teach. And I push back. I said, there are some things that you don't know. Like they just had this conference that I was involved in. They had a Black Lives Matter. And of course, the white people were all excited about what they were listening to. Well, I grew up in Georgia. Nothing that was said that I didn't
Exactly.
know anything about, because as a child, I mean, I met Martin Luther King in my backyard because they would come down there because Dr. W.G. Anderson lived right up the street from me. So C.B. King and all of those people. So I do think that it's more than just the material. I do
Yes.
think it's the connecting that we may have to make with our children. Um, I mean, sometimes what a Black teacher would tolerate from a Black boy in particular, they might get sent to the office because of the same thing. So what you bring to the situation has a lot to do. And children know very early on whether or not teachers like them or connecting with them. And so there are some things. I mean, I work with my white teachers because I wrote a book on social equity teaching. And when they are writing their lesson plans, I'm looking to see what's in those lesson plans. And sometimes they get upset, and I tell them that's a human emotion. Get over it, because they don't know where life is going to take them. Um, so you might not be teaching people that look like you, sound like you, agree with you. And I do think we have to show teachers how to understand different ways of thinking and learning, because a lot of times I find that a lot of people that are teaching our children have not met people that don't look like them sometimes. And so
Exactly.
when they go into those spaces, what they think is a problem is not a problem.
Well, you mentioned the importance of the teachers connecting with the students that they teach,
Mm-hmm,
and vice versa. It's a relationship
mm-hmm,
that's built. Now that we're in the midst of this pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, um, distance education puts the teacher even further away from the students. So, how would you assess the impact of distance education because of the virus on students of color?
For one thing, I wrote a book entitled New Ways to Engage Parents. And so I feel that we live in a technological society, and there are ways that they can connect with their students via Zoom. Because one of my students did her dissertation, she's working with people all the way over in Korea, and she's dealing with Zoom. So like Flipgrid and some of the innovative ways. I mean, text messages, almost every parent has a text message, doing short videos. Those are ways. So just because they're not in a school situation, there are still ways to connect with the families. You can give them a morning message. I believe in a scope and sequence of parent involvement built around the curriculum, making sure that parents understand what it is you are trying to teach in your class. And there are all kinds of ways that teachers can model with all the videos they can send. I mean, even this summer, I took a class on how to interface with my students differently because I'm teaching completely online. and I have conversations with them. We text. I leave messages like we or our platform here at Michigan State is Desire to Learn. It's called D2L. So if a student has written something and I can go into their um, lesson and give a message. But now let me say this to you. Then again, it depends on the school district and what kind of technology they have. So if a school district, if technology is available and schools don't have it, then some kids are going to have it and some kids are not going to have it. But I do think that school districts have to think in new and different kinds of ways in the situation that we find ourselves in.
Um, Social media. A lot of our young people today are very much involved in social media, and some of the parents are also,
Mm-hmm.
as intergenerational.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, from your perspective, can social media help enhance the students' engagement with the curriculum, with the text, with the subject matter of the course, or sometimes do you think social media is a distraction?
For one thing, I think the young people are digital natives. I mean, my students know a lot more about technology than I do. I think it depends on what it is. If it's Facebook, I mean, like we do have Facebook groups with our students. I don't deal with my students on Facebook or Twitter, but I do think there are some types of technology, because that's just the world we live in,
Yes.
that can be very supportive um, in a curriculum. And but so it depends on what kind of social media you are engaging with the students on.
Right.
I mean, students can play games, they can do all kinds of things, but I do think that technology has to be carefully selected. I know there's a whole body of research on, do students comprehend better with technology? It's kind of up in the air and sort of divided. What are students reading? Because people can post anything. So I do think people have to be careful with what's posted and what their students actually see.
Right. I like the term you use, digital natives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes um, there may be a generation gap where Generation Z and millennials have a different take about the use of technology. And,
Mm-hmm.
and I think sometimes that a lot of young people in the classroom, as they're all in distance education, may be more technically engaged, digitally engaged
Mm-hmm.
than the teachers. So
Yes, they are.
the extent to which that we can have more digital involvement in the delivery of the educational subject matter in the curriculum and foster some type of digital relationship with the student, rather than things being divergent. There may be a convergence of engagement. But it's how you use technology.
It's how you use technology. Like for example, nobody in my class has paper and pencil. Everything is iPad. In fact, every freshman that comes to school here has to have a computer. So it's like, where are the books? I mean, I still like to read books, but that's the world in which we're living in. Of course, every professor here was like told to take courses in technology. Like, there are some things I know about technology because our master's program has been completely online. So I have people in my class from China, and now they are Americans who teach in American international schools, Korea, Germany, China, they're all over the country. And I tell them, if I'm going to meet with them, it's going to be 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I don't care if they have to be at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm not getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning. So I do think, I know at one point when cell phones first came out, and almost every child has a cell phone, people didn't want them to use them in class. Well, that created a problem because you either let them use the cell phone or they're going to use it anyway. and they're going to be
Right.
doing text messages. Like nowadays in a classroom, students can take pictures of you, they can send stuff to the administration, and they can do it in real time. So you can't tell them to put their phones away. Even small children, they use their phones. So I do think that most of the young teachers coming out will know a lot about technology and how to engage students.
Very good. Um, your insights are very helpful, Dr. Edwards. One of the things I wanted to ask you before we close, from your perspective as a distinguished professor in education, what are the three most important things we need to do to close the education gap, particularly for African American students in the larger society?
For one thing, I think from the time a child enters school, we need to make sure that that child arrives in school on grade level. So we need to make sure that we focus on early literacy development. So when a child comes to school, they are not coming chronologically 5 and developmentally 2. I think we also need to look at parental literacy. Even though we are the richest country, in my opinion, in the world, we still have a high illiteracy rate. And one of the first big projects that I did that got the recognition of First Lady Barbara Bush was a program that I did called Parents as Partners in Reading. And what I discovered at this particular school is that 40% of the parents couldn't read. And so I think we have to drill down on that. I think we have to also work on equal funding because there is a funding gap. And so with I mean, schools have to have materials, they have to have teachers that want to teach at those particular schools. So I do think the great divide is funding, who are we teaching? Because let me give you an example. I wrote another book called Partnering with Families for Student Success. And, when people think about parents, they don't think about incarcerated families. They don't think about homeless families, low literate families. So there are a lot of different kinds of families coming into school. So I would be asking teachers to look at who are you teaching, because where you teach, who you teach has a lot to do with the success of students. I mean, I teach in a privileged environment where by the time I teach a student, I don't teach undergrads. I basically teach graduate students and those interns. Well, they are the successful students. And so I do think that we really have to look at who are we missing. And that's what I discovered is that there was a high rate of illiteracy in this country.
Very good.
We don't talk about it, but it's there.
Yes. Well, we may want to follow up with you about that issue, Dr. Evans, because literacy, reading literacy, financial literacy, there's so many issues that we need to try to overcome in the African American community and other people of color communities. But I just want to thank you for this time that you've spent with us. But you've raised some significant issues. I already know we want to follow up with you. Now, you held up those books that you've written. Are those books available digitally? How do people get
Oh
copies?
yeah. They can actually, Teachers College Press has published 2 of them. I can shoot you an email. I can send it to Dr. Primus. And
Okay.
so yeah, and in fact, the book New Ways to Engage Parents, that particular book got a national award from I think it's Delta Kappa Gamma. I had never heard of Delta Kappa Gamma. It was started in 1929 at the University of Texas. And when I checked on it, it was an all-white teachers group. So when I won the award, I said, this book must be really good because we had, this group, and that book has done quite well. And I just won a huge award on Friday. I won an Oscar. It was called the Oscar Causey Award. And I was the first African American reading researcher to receive that award. And no other African American had ever received that award. So I thought, wow,
Well,
maybe I have arrived.
congratulations.
Thank you, thank you, thank
Congratulations.
you.
And Stacy, I know you're listening, but I want to do an article about this award that Dr. Edwards has just received. That's very good.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you.
And look, we want to stay in touch. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your commitment. And on behalf of the National Newspaper Publishers Association and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we're very grateful for your service.
Well, thank you so very much. This is an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to talk to you about some of them days down in Georgia also.
Okay, that came from Albany.
Absolutely. Absolutely.